Um, and yeah, so a bit about Mutile. She's an interdisciplinary impact practitioner with a keen interest in addressing challenges in the interface of health and climate change using systems practice and future and foresight methods. Her work involves thinking about intersections and interconnectedness, managing complexity and power dynamics, and identifying leverage points that can transform systems. A lot that you do, right, Mutile, and very important work. And it will be great to know also a bit more about not just how you deal with change and how does this topic come up for you, but also more broadly about your work and development dynamics as well. Um, so just a quick introduction, but I'll let you present and add more if you'd like to. And that's a quick, quick introduction, and I'll share the floor with you, Mutile. And yeah, please, you can share a bit more about you, development dynamics, and then we can go to the features.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yasmin. Super excited to be here. And to as much as you are interviewing me, I find this as a really good opportunity to learn from you guys as well. So yeah, briefly, my name is Mutile Mwongo. I'm from Nairobi in Kenya, and I work around research, knowledge, and systems practice at Development Dynamics. Um, Maybe just to give a little backstory, my background is microbiology and biotechnology, and that is what got me interested in interconnections because microbiology is all about how microorganisms interact with their environment. And so there's so many interconnections, interdependencies, and ways that they relate with larger organisms, with the soil, with water, and all those intricate things are what stood out for me. And so that was my foray into thinking about interconnectedness. And then, slowly as the years go by, I start to see that things are changing in the environment. Um, and of course, climate change becomes a very prominent topic. So once I figured out that climate change is an interconnections problem, where there are dynamics of, first of all, it's caused by greenhouse gas emissions. But why do those greenhouse gas emissions occur? There's a long history of economics that plays into, the industrial revolution that drove these greenhouse gas emissions to occur. And so it just kept on developing, trying to figure out, okay, I also have a background in microbiology, which means I'm thinking about health, I'm thinking about the human body, I'm thinking about animals. And so it became a whole circle of interconnections. So that was my focus on climate change and health, and slowly became a larger focus on systems thinking and systems practice. And so that's what I do now, or I try to do. And I think it's very interesting, but also quite challenging to think in systems because it's there's so much to consider, um, and no one approach works. So you have to talk to so many people. You have to think about all the different angles that one problem can be approached from. There's so much you need to dig deep into and to unpack and to peel the layers, which takes quite some time. So I find it very fascinating, but also quite challenging. But I enjoy it. So that's about me.
Nice, thank you very much, Mutile. Yeah, it's interesting that you things started in a very small scale kind of research and then went all the way up to systemic change and global change. So seeing that some ideas can be applied in very specific uh, small lens, but also it can be applied to the whole globe or universe even. some rules and principles work the same, right? So it's interesting to see that. Um, yeah, thank you for the introduction about yourself. If you'd like to share a bit more about development dynamics as well, as an organization and some of the work that you are doing with them, would be nice as well.
Sure. If I can share my screen,
Sure.
I will. Let me just check if that works.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So development dynamics is a Pan-African think tank, do tank and through tank, which means we work across different areas. We call ourselves thinkers because we understand and acknowledge complexity. And so we know that one way to approach that is just by thinking, by spending time trying to understand, to unpack, as I mentioned, to do research, to analyze these complex challenges that we're facing. Because I think the past decade or so has just been a lot happening. There's been COVID-19, there's been global conflict, there's been what seems to be like an economic recession, and all these things are happening seemingly at the same time. So just thinking about what is the space for Africans in this system, and what solutions can we consider and propose. And then as a do tank, we do analysis, we work with people who are in the space, who are in the ecosystem, by offering consulting services and advisory services, just helping them to figure out the challenges that they're facing, either in their organization or in the field that they work in. And then as a through tank, we work around helping people who receive funding to make the best use of that funding, but also just connecting them with investors who believe and have the same values that they have. So again, collaborating with investors, investees, and intermediaries. You'll notice we think a lot in threes. So our tagline is that we reframe, reimagine, and resolve complex challenges. So think tank, do tank, through tank, investors, investees, and intermediaries, and then reframing, reimagining, and resolving challenges. Our values are that we put people first because people are the core of everything that we do. We know that top-down approaches often don't work in the long term. And so we try to keep people and community at the center of all the ideation and innovation we bring to the table. We champion love and liberation because people deserve human dignity. And then we practice stewardship to people, to our partners, and to the planet because, again, we all make up the ecosystem and we have the responsibility to take care of it. So that's, I think, the top level of it. The think tank is what we call the Insights Hub, where I mentioned we try to fill knowledge gaps. We facilitate knowledge sharing. So we have regular convenings, webinars, which we call Last Thursdays. We also are the Innovation Accelerator. So that's what I mentioned. We are a consulting and advisory practice. And finally, an investment catalyst, just also thinking about how to decolonize philanthropy, financing mechanisms, so that the people who need the financing actually get it in an equitable way, and are able to use it in the best way possible. So that's, I think, briefly what I would like to say for now about development dynamics.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think the power of three, right, is very important, very powerful. So yeah, really, really like the work that you do and the way that you approach um your your events and your webinars. I think it's very related to some of the things that we do, but also to what is needed, right? The topic of systems change and the topic of how to see the interconnections and how to enable innovation and people thriving in their workspace and fulfilling their own pathways, right? So this is very, very important. So yeah, thank you for sharing more about development dynamics. So I will start with a couple of questions, and then we can have a general conversation, shall we? Good. So my first question to start with, since we're talking about change in complex environments, we can start with your understanding of complex environments and how different it is from other environments, simple or complicated. And yeah, we can start from that and then see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for the question. I draw my understanding of simple, complicated, and complex environments from two, I think they're sociologists, Gluberman and Zimmerman, and they proposed this framework called the cake, rocket, and the child problem typology framework, which is just a way of classifying problems. So making a cake would be considered a simple problem. Um, Raising a child would be on the other extreme, a complex problem, and then right in the middle, it would be sending a rocket to space or to the moon. That would be a complicated problem. And the idea behind this is that for simple problems, there's almost like a method, a scientific method around how to do it. So for baking a cake, there are certain ingredients that you put together, you whisk them up, put them in the oven at a certain temperature, and then you get a cake. And even though you're not experienced, through repetition and practice, you're pretty much able to get the same results every time. And so that's a simple problem. There's a formula, follow the formula, and it works out. A complicated problem would be one where there's a bit of expertise required, but again, repetition and practice makes it possible. So when you're thinking about a rocket, in the first place, you would probably need a pretty high level of understanding around astronomy, um, engineering, and so on. So there is a degree to which you need deep knowledge around the topic. But at the same time, you're able to figure it out. There are very precise formulas that enable you to send a rocket to the moon. Um, Engineering comes into play. There's the whole thing of how much fuel is required. When it goes to the moon, how long can it stay up there? It comes back down. People have done it, and there's an approach that works for it. When it comes to complex problems, though, there are very many variables, and there's no agreed formula. There's no silver bullet or consensus. So when we think about raising a child, there are many approaches that work, but they won't all work for the same child. At the same time, there are many factors that influence the outcomes of the child. So there is their genetic makeup, there is the social environment, the economic environment, the access to healthcare, and all these things. So remove one thing, it kind of tips the scale in one way or the other. And even we know that two children brought up in the same home don't have the same outcomes, don't end up the same. So that's a complex problem because first of all, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous. There's no one can say this is the dictionary or the formula that tells you how to bring up a good child. And I think that's how I approach complex environments. A lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty, and just a high level of what exactly is going on. There's so many things that influence this environment that it's difficult to pinpoint a certain approach that will work across the board.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, another word that came to me as you're speaking is adaptability, right? Children, um, are very good at adapting to the circumstances, and sometimes uh, understanding the bottom line of a specific scenario, and then trying to challenge, right, something that has been put in place, and uh, it's very dynamic. So that makes it very difficult to, or almost impossible, and not even, I think, likely to predict. And then, yeah, it is difficult, and every situation is unique, right? So to deal as it comes, deal with it as it comes. Nice. So, as a researcher and systems thinker, the concept of change is probably one you need to deal with all the time, right? So, do you mind sharing with us what do you think change means to you, and how you encounter change in your everyday work?
Mhm. Yeah, difficult question. Um, I mean, I think just going by definition, change is a variation. So there is a baseline and there is maybe an end line, and change is the gap in between those two, or a midline, for example. So change is anything that is not what previously existed. Um, as a researcher, we are constantly trying to figure out answers to questions, or even sometimes the questions themselves. What are the right questions to ask so that um, we understand this issue better? Because if you have the wrong question, then you're going round in circles. So that's how it comes across in the research work. In the systems thinking work, I think change is really, it's almost a fundamental concept within systems thinking, because the whole point of systems thinking is to kind of influence the system through change. Um, so there's no way you can remove change from systems thinking or from research. Um, in my work, I think currently, at least, I'm dealing a lot with the health research ecosystem, and the challenges that we are facing in the health research ecosystem are often around funding. So, in Africa, we rely a lot on foreign funding from the global north. And that brings an interesting power dynamic, excuse me, because the funder often dictates what research is carried out. They have a very huge influence on the system or the ecosystem. So within an African health research ecosystem, we're trying to ask, how do we regain agency and ownership of our ecosystems so that the research that is conducted on the continent is what is a priority to the continent. Um, Sometimes funders would want certain issues to be funded. A random example might be, maybe someone is interested in malaria, or there's a focus on malaria at a certain time. And so an implementing body would do that research because they have access to the funding, even though maybe at the same time the rates of malaria in that specific region have already fallen, but they're doing it because they have access to the funding and it's a requirement. Power brings influence, money brings power. So again, it's the whole question of who calls the shots. So I think that goes across the board. It's not only in health research, it's in many issues. It's in social issues, environmental issues. The change really has to happen in the space of the power dynamics. So we're trying to shift power from those who have a lot of power to those who have perhaps a bit less power, but are the ones who understand their context best and are the ones who are doing the work. That's how I would respond.
Nice, yeah. You're saying about the how different contexts enable different ways of understanding a specific situation, or different perspectives that influence how that specific event is going to develop, right, through power dynamics. If you have, as you said, more power, then you have more lever in some ways of enabling the change in specific scenarios, right? And if you don't have that much power, then in some ways you are a bit less, a bit more vulnerable to the changes that are happening. Is that is that right? Do you agree with that?
I do, because power brings influence, and you've also mentioned yeah, that dynamic is an unequal one. So it comes with it inequity, sometimes injustice, and I think it's just part of the human condition, unfortunately, or some of these things are just inherent within the way humans work. Um, I think it would be very hard or challenging to shift that the system where money brings power and power brings influence, because that has probably existed for thousands of years, since the beginning of time. Um, Perhaps the way we can think about it is, how do we just make things a bit more equal? How do we empower the disempowered, even when they don't have the influence or the money that is required to have that power? So I wouldn't say I have all the answers. I have very few answers. Um, but that's how I think about it at the moment.
Nice. Thank you. Very good. Um, so my next question is about adapting to these changes and to these challenges. So do you have any heuristics or principles or tools that help you deal with change in the complex environment you're embedded in? It can be work, it can be your uh, maybe work in a community, in the city, in different levels. Any principles or ideas, ways that you deal with?
Um, yes, sometimes. I think in terms of principles, to me, what resonates is that power needs to be shifted. Um, so I think that's at the core of how I interact with change, where we know power is often concentrated in some individuals, some institutions, organizations, for whatever reasons they are. Sometimes sometimes it's money, sometimes it's connections and networks. All those reasons exist. So to me, shifting the power is a very important principle, because then we're trying to balance the scale a little bit. um, the power concentration becomes very entrenched. So it's hard to undo a system that exists. I think systems often resist change in the first place. But to me, that's one of the principles I hold very closely. Um, it's challenging because when you're dealing with something like that, there's a lot to undo. Um, might include behavior change, which is not my area of expertise. But maybe we are thinking about or talking about, how do we incentivize the right motivations? So perhaps the power is concentrated because of selfish motivations, different values, whatever it is. Um, might be hard to change the system, like I mentioned. So how do we disincentivize maybe the motivations that lead to that system? How do we incentivize more equal approaches to dealing with things like those? And then in terms of the tools, I think a very practical one is the iceberg model or the framework. Um, that has come in very handy for me across my work. It's really, the visual helps so much to unpack the layers of complex and wicked problems. And so you just drawing the iceberg out and thinking about what is at the narrative level and the mental models, what are the beliefs that are deeply held that we don't often see. What are the patterns and trends? What are the, at the very top, what are the symptoms of the problem? That has really helped to understand problems at a deep level. I think when it comes to heuristics or mental shortcuts, and just dealing with change, one, because change is pretty uncomfortable most of the time. One I try to remember or remind myself is that change is the only constant, which is a nice oxymoron there. I think it was a Greek philosopher who came up with that idea, and it's pretty true. Every moment is in flux. At every moment, something is changing because things will never be constant. So just acknowledging that reality, that change will always happen, helps to not be so overwhelmed or stressed out when either you're trying to influence change through a change initiative or when you're sort of the recipient of the change. I think just knowing that change will always be there, then that helps you to just settle down and somehow accept that this is how things are.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, there are different levels of change as well, right? Even in complex environments. So yeah, I remember one example that I heard that, to me, to understand more of the importance of changing, for example, narratives or the mental models, to then changing the the behaviors. I think one of the most interesting examples that I've heard was about smoking. So how smoke went from something very cool and very popular and uh, very people are celebrating that image of someone smoking, to an image of unhealthy habits, and um, a way that people associated that with behaviors to not be perpetuated, right? Um, so how did that happen? Well, we can spend hours and hours here just talking about it, but it's just incredible how the narrative is not the behavior in itself that changed, is the narrative around that behavior that made that event become more or less popular. So the reasons why people do what they do is not necessarily that apparent or
Mm.
that visible, and that changes everything, right? That influences our everyday behaviors in ways that we are not even aware of most of the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is.
And often the hardest part to influence.
Yes, exactly. So how you first become aware of that story of the narrative, and then, which is a challenge in itself. But
Mm.
then once you are aware, how to then guide that that narrative in a way that it makes more sense for that specific context, right? If it's a person, if it's a family, if it's a country, a continent, whatever. And yeah, that's definitely easier said than done, for sure. Yes. Um, so another question is, do you have any advice for people who are struggling to deal with change, be in their workspace or any complex environment?
Um, yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to respond to this because, yeah, like I mentioned, change is very overwhelming most of the time. Um, on the one hand, if you're the one initiating the change, it's like a huge mountain that you have to get over. And then if you're on the other side of the coin, being the recipient of change, it's also overwhelming because um, you're comfortable in a certain environment and context. Just for an example, maybe you have a nice new job, things are going really well, and then suddenly you lose your job. That's a change that has happened to you. You're the recipient of it. No matter the situation, it's often very overwhelming. So, first of all, I think it's good to acknowledge that change can bring those feelings of overwhelm, and not to be stressed out by the fact that you are feeling overwhelmed in the first place. It's very normal, and I think it's good to accept these human reactions to external things that happen to a balance, because as humans, as organisms, all biology wants to maintain some kind of balance. Change disrupts the balance. So just acknowledging that something has happened, it makes me uncomfortable, makes me feel overwhelmed. That's okay. That's just the first step. It's okay to feel like there's some imbalance in that moment. Um, yeah, so just acknowledging it. And then secondly, maybe I would say to try and identify a few allies in the certain context you are experiencing or working in, I think is really helpful. People who understand what it means to be facing this mountain or at the bottom of the mountain and trying to push like a rock up the hill. Um, First of all, they, just sharing ideas around how to accept the change that is happening, sharing ideas about how to overcome or get over the change that is happening. It's just really important because no one has all the answers. Like I said, um, thinking about in systems, there are lots of variables. We can't know everything as a single person. There's a limit to what we can understand. So finding a few allies, I think, is also a really good way to deal with change.
Awesome. Yeah, there is a question that came to me now. When you're saying about how difficult it is to deal with change because that takes away our or the ground that we created, right? Or that takes away some of the foundations that we created, and then being uncomfortable in this space of creating new foundations, it is very difficult.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, or my guess is that the work of futures and foresight may allow some interesting, or at least could help us imagine what a future scenario could look like, and then be a bit more confident to create these new foundations, right? And a lot of what stops us from pursuing new goals or changing is also um, our reasons not to do so.
Mhm.
Our internal reasons why we should avoid them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think my question is, how do you think features and foresight could help the dealing with change?
Mm. Yes. So features and foresight, I think, helps you to get comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, which is all about change. Um, Systems thinking maybe helps you to see the uncertainty. Futures and foresight helps you to just get comfortable with it and perhaps not dwell too much on this uncertainty because there's so many possible futures. The future is not a simple extension of the past. It's not like a straight line. There's what is possible, what is plausible, what is implausible, what is uh, preferred. There's so many versions of the future that we can find in the future that it allows you a range of possibilities to deal with, and that somehow takes away the burden of dealing with the change. So I think it's good to have that kind of mindset, and also very helpful because then we are not um, waiting for the future to happen to us. We take up a very active role in shaping it, because every moment is a step towards the future, and we don't need to receive the future. We can play a role in shaping what it becomes. and driving things this way or that way into what we see is an ideal state. So I think futures and foresight it has quite a lot of similarities with systems thinking, and is kind of just an extension into how then do we act now that we know what currently exists.
Yeah, that's very nice. Yeah, there's a lot that we can say about change, right? Yeah, can see Linda's comment here. I recently read someone giving their opinion that now there is less connection among people due to reduced number of smokers. Apparently, smokers can start a conversation just from sharing a lighter. Nice. Would you like to comment on that, Linda?
Yeah, it just made me think of, the other consequences that we don't think about, like about any action that can be taken. Yes, smoking was such a bad habit, was introduced like such a cool thing, such a fashionable thing, and it had to stop. I mean, people lost lives. But there's that one nice thing about it that also that also went because now there's more and more people are being conscious about the side effects of smoking, and it's no longer fashionable. Yeah. But then there's no other habit that has kind of taken over that can help people to strangers to just start conversations from, from anywhere, like that connection among people. Yeah, there's that was taken away by the reduced smoking. Yeah.
Nice, very good. What do you think about that, Mutile?
Yeah, it's interesting how a good change, people have stopped smoking can lead to another bad change where now people are losing connections. Um, Perhaps the challenge was they didn't think in systems there, because then how do you fill the gap that is left by a non-smoking approach, or prohibition of smoking? Um, I don't know what the answer would be. I think it's a question, really.
Yeah, interesting. So thank you very much for sharing this scene, Linda, this data. Because I think it shows very well how complex systems work. Is
Mm.
not right or wrong, right? It's not let's just change all these parts here and everything's gonna be sorted. Because with enabling one change in one specific part of the system, then it influences so many others that many that we are not even aware of. That is a thing, right? It is an important part to socialize and to talk to new people. And maybe that's not one part of the challenge, right, of smoking that we took into consideration even before. We just said it is a bad thing altogether. And as you said, Mutile, it's not really, um, yeah, it is not thinking in systems when we think that we have all the answers and everything's going to be great or everything's going to be the worst thing ever. And then that's it. So just these extremes, right, of right and wrong. So don't work too much in systems. Nice. And yeah, there's there is jobs lost too. Yes, in this process of now everyone that was working in the tobacco factories or organizations, right, that had to
Mm.
adapt and do something else.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can't always play like a cause and effect game with these things, because yeah, you just really have to understand all the interconnections. Maybe the reason people were actually smoking was to make connections in the first place. Maybe it wasn't a by the way, like a side effect. Maybe it was the main objective of picking up smoking. So yeah, those drivers kind of have to be addressed at the narrative and the mental model level first before thinking about people are smoking. That's what we can see. Why are they smoking? They need connections. So just filling that gap first, and then hopefully it causes a ripple effect where the need to smoke stops being a thing.
Yeah, nice. Interesting. So I have lots of questions in here. I could just spend 3 hours just continuing this conversation on change. But I will open if anyone has any questions that you would like to ask. I'm happy to go for loads more. Yes, Martin.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. This is an interesting conversation. I was following in the beginning when Mutile was speaking, talking about her interest in research, some of the challenges that she's been observing in advancing the research on the continent. She spoke about money, power, influence. I was actually thinking about it not only in research, but overall, looking at the position of our continent. We have the expertise, we have our own resources. We also have expertise on the continent. And I was reflecting to say, but what is that is blocking us to mobilize our own resources? Because she mentioned the fact that most of actors in the social sectors, we all heavily rely on funding, and the funding is mostly coming from the Western world. And I was trying to reflect also to think of what is blocking us as African to leverage on our resources. I was thinking of the dynamics or the connections or the relationship between power and money and influence. I also thought of a political aspect. Politics, not political mostly, but I'm thinking more on politics and how politics plays a role. It's another variable in that space when it comes to engaging, because if you think of money, the influence, I mean, we have the possibility to leverage financial capital because we have resources as a continent. I mean, now more we're talking about African philanthropies. But also you have some, when it comes to power, you're looking at aspect of political control. So who's controlling the people who have a say or who have a decision to make when it comes to maybe mobilizing resources or redirecting resources to serve our cause, which the one that we all trying to resolve. And even when you think another step further, when you think of power, political control, you also think of how it's shaping policies. Our policies on the continent, when it comes to addressing the key issues that we are facing, policies, but also linking it to resources, allocations, more importantly. So there are initiatives when it comes to money. I mean, I'm talking about hearing more networks that are raising. We're talking about philanthropies, I mean, like philanthropies coming together, trying to build a sort of a network. But what are the things that are not allowing those networks to really identify the key issues that are blocking us or keeping us behind? And the politics play a key role there again, because then you're looking at political sponsors, be it from outside the continent and even inside the continent. And when you link it to the aspect of power, then you start looking at issues around corruptions and how that's creating that ripple effect of processes. There is something that Mutile said, which I really like. She says that finding, I can't recall exactly how she put it, but in a way, it's about, she spoke about allies, finding allies, people that are seeing things the same way as you see. Because you see the challenge that we have is when everything is centered around money, and as we were saying, money, power, influence, it's difficult to change such systems. But if you start thinking of people are driven by something that is in them. I don't know, for lack of word, I can say like passion, like, and people like that are rare to find. But I think if we create connections or network where we really find those people that are driven by passion, who understand the challenge that we have as a continent, and start taking a responsibility and creating those network. I mean, if you think of the two loops model, when you are transitioning, and that's where you can start finding small innovations. But then the challenge is the willingness. I mean, who's willing to do that? In most platforms I've been to, people they speak nice stuff, but when it comes to coming together and implement, everybody's looking on their way because of, as I said, interest are diverting and stuff like that. So the more we start talking about these things, we really go to Mutile was talking about the iceberg model. I think more work needs to be done at the mental model. Mental models are key. I mean, if you look at most of key actors in the social sector, those that are pretending to drive change, I feel like more work needs to be done there. We have to be asking critical questions. We have to be asking ourselves questions that we are afraid to talk about openly, and maybe start taking a step toward shifting those dynamics, because the system can change if you've got people that are there to shift those key things that we spoke about: power dynamics, resource allocation, and so on. So that's the comment I wanted to make. It's a very interesting conversation, and I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Mutile, comments on that?
Yeah, you've brought in the topic we can't ignore, which is politics and geopolitics, and governance as well. It does bring a very difficult dimension, because then I find it challenging to talk about Africa's political state without talking about colonialism. Africa is a very old continent, but African states are significantly younger than other states around the world, in the sense that most countries got independence in the 60s, some much later in the 90s. So you can just imagine the disruptions that happened, first at the mental level, because there's so many ways in which the beliefs, traditional beliefs that were very closely held, were considered barbaric, or not civilized enough. And therefore, when you have centuries of that, it really takes a toll on how you approach life. I think the continent maybe is still dealing with those colonial hangovers, which is not to say that we shouldn't take up ownership of what is happening and agency. It's not that we need to continue, let's say, blaming what happened in the past. I think it's just really acknowledging what happened and being very proactive and deliberate about changing those colonial hangovers that still cripple the continent. It's a difficult conversation, because again, our grandparents, people we know, were very active in some of those liberation movements. Some people were beneficiaries of colonial systems. So again, we're thinking about the whole spectrum. Some people collaborated with the oppressors, other people fought very hard against it, and yet they exist in the same country. Their offspring, or their children, their children's children also are dealing with the same problems. So I don't know how or how long it would take to shift their mindsets. But I think that's where it really needs to start, in order to combat the governance problems and the corruption that prevent the really good ideas that are on the ground from actually being implemented. Because we don't lack, like you mentioned, financial resources, innovation. There's just so much that people have, but there are many blockers that prevent them from actually implementing the work that they want to.
Very nice. Yes, Linda has a comment on that or a question.
Yeah, I guess it's both a comment and a question. I'm just picking up, Mutile, from what you mentioned just now about colonial hangover. So I think um, like the word hangover itself comes from after you consume something for some time, then the effects are lingering, right? And I think this hangover is really long overdue. I mean, the last country on the continent to get independent was South Africa in 1994, which is uh, like close to 40 years ago. So now I think we need to get to that point where we accept that, yes, it happened. And then how do we move on from there? We cannot continue for close to 100 years still talking um, about the hangover. And I think this morning we were having a conversation also about um, indigenous knowledge. So my question comes now to you to say, when it comes to that hangover, we can talk about removing it, but what are we replacing that knowledge with? Because we can clearly see there are so many things that are not working for Africa that we have been copying and pasting. Like all our systems are basically not us. And I think there is a certain responsibility as Africans that we need to take and say, this doesn't work for us. We're not saying it's bad. It's okay for you guys if you like it, if it's working for you, that's good. But it's not working for us. Honestly, um, without getting too deep into political, getting into a political conversation. But we are all hung up in this cycle of elections, you know. That's everything that is going on in the city. It's about who's going to be in power. And when they're thinking about getting into power, it's not about what development are they going to do. It's about how they're going to benefit for themselves and their families. So that thing, it clearly shows that that whole system of elections and we need to start think about it again. Is it working for us? You know. So my question is on, after you are hungover, you probably need a Coke and I don't know what and a painkiller or whatever. What are we taking? Yeah, that's my question. Yeah. Yasmin, do you take Coke when you're hungover? The way you're laughing.
Don't resonate at all with this question. No, don't know what that means.
Yeah, that's a very hard question. And you're very right. It's beyond time to stop holding on to the colonial hangovers and making it the excuse for why the system is being perpetuated. We know that it's not working. I don't know. I think sometimes the challenge might be that so much of that indigenous knowledge is actually lost or forgotten or repressed and suppressed in some ways, which is why people are finding it hard to connect to what existed in the past and what worked for us before this whole colonial system came in. And we know that there were very deliberate ways in which our indigenous knowledge was taken away. We know that. I think what we need to do is to be very proactive about, if we know that that knowledge has disappeared in some way, then we need to now create our own new knowledge now. We need to say, like you mentioned, that system is good for you, but it doesn't work for us in our context, in the climate that we work in, both physical climate, social climate, environment, political climate, and so on. So maybe we just really need to do the groundwork of building up from the ground new things that do have links to our ancestral ways of being. Trying to find those threads that still remain, but just saying, this really doesn't work. We need to make a new way of living for ourselves. That would be my proposition. without having done any anthropology, I'm not an expert on this.
Nice. We need to create maybe new narratives about what is something to strive for and what is not, right? Well done. And I would like to just finish with the last question. I would like to highlight and acknowledge the great work that Development Dynamics is doing in putting together a masterclass on movement building for social impact. And I really recommend everyone to follow GD and subscribe to the next cohort, because it's very, very interesting content. So in talking about movement building, what do you think it's the importance in dealing with major systemic changes in the world?
Yeah, great question. I think movement building is just all about collective action, collective intelligence, collective knowledge, and that just being in a collective and collaborating, I think, helps very much to influence systems and cause systems change. So DD's approach is to support people to build movements, people work in the social sector, environmental sector, health sector, whatever it is. Because of course, we know that there are very complex challenges that we are facing and no one can deal with them alone. Then how about we identify our allies, but in a very intentional way, bring them together. Everyone brings their expertise, their lived experience, and learns how to build a movement, a community, a network. Networks have the ability of just spreading almost on their own. So one person knows one person and it spreads out. I think that's what we've realized at DD is one of the ways of dealing or addressing complex challenges. So the movement building class is it addresses some of those issues. We try to ask ourselves, what exactly is a movement? What is a coalition? What is a community? What are the key aspects that define a community? You need to maybe have a shared purpose. You have to have shared values, shared identity. And those are things that it's not that we are imposing upon someone. They just come up naturally in community. People have shared purpose, shared values, shared identity. And so we're trying to tap into that natural way that people come together in families, in clans, whatever it is, as friends, those things that tie people together. How about we be more intentional about the things we want to see changing in society? So that's what the movement building masterclass is about. And yeah, we're really excited to welcome whoever is available for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Mutile. And yeah, great way to close off this interview. Yeah, we need a second round because I still have a lot of questions. So yeah, thank you for sharing your expertise with us and your practice and experience. Yeah, it's been great to have this conversation today. I will just quickly share the last bit. Thank you for participating. And yeah, these are the next events that we have. These are the QR code that goes directly to the platform event. We are going to talk about food systems and systems thinking on May the 14th. And then afterwards, we have an interview with a professional in systems thinking approach to corruption proofing in Africa. So on the May 20th. So these are the next, what's coming next for us. And yeah, leave here the QR code to participate in the systems change community, the systems features platform. And yeah, that's it for today. thank you again for everyone participating. Thank you, Mutile, for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us. And yeah, see you next time. Take care.
Thank you. See you.
See you. Bye bye.